good to be here, and I want to pick up on something that Daniel just said, really thinking about the SDGs and the development of indicators as a real opportunity for us as spiritual and religious people. That this is a coming together around a new development paradigm, and it's an opportunity for us to really reflect on what development really is for. And we need to weigh in as the indicators get developed for that over the next year, which means becoming deeply involved in the high-level political forum, which takes responsibility for approving those indicators. And I'll come back to that at the end. I too thought I might start with a little bit of reflection on what is spirituality, since we're talking about spiritual history. And I think of it as having three dimensions. And the first one is really a sense of something deeper that's moving in the evolutionary process, that's a mystery, and there are many names that people put on top of it, but it's not just a random chance, materialistic, absurd existence unfolding. It's actually something driven by something much deeper and much more profound, and that's something we can connect to and be guided by. So that's sort of the first sense, a sense of a deeper reality. The second one is actually the sort of spirituality is actually the sort of characteristics, virtues that it lends us if we approach it properly. And Rami Shapiro defines it as an ever-deepening capacity to embrace life with justice, compassion, curiosity, awe, wonder, serenity, and humility. So there are a set of, what should we call them, values, virtues that spirituality cultivates in us. And the third part really is service. It's sort of leaving ego at the door. It's actually being much more oriented toward the well-being of the whole, of others, and acting in an ethic of service. And if we think of that as a framework, what we can think of the whole history of the UN, in a sense, is starting with a very strong emphasis on spirituality, in part because we'd just gone through these two horrible wars. There was a real sense of despair and hope and a need to ground things in something much deeper. And so that was much more present. Then I think what actually happened gradually over time was that we became much more materialistic in our sense of what development is for. I mean, certainly this was started with the Bretton Woods institutions and with a kind of agreement among the founders of the UN that the only way we were going to avoid war and create peace was to enlist everybody in the pursuit of prosperity. And over time, prosperity began to be more and more reduced to short-term economic growth. And it really lost a lot of the human and spiritual and moral side of what development's all about. Nonetheless, during that whole phase, and we've talked a bit about Dag Hammarskjöld and his efforts creating the meditation room and being very oriented towards spirituality as a foundation for peace. U Thant was also very oriented that way, and in fact in his closing speech when he left the UN, he really emphasized the importance of spirituality as the most important virtue to be cultivated in men and women. After that period, there certainly was a lot of activity. Robert Mueller was focused very much on this, and the Temple of Understanding, the Baha'is United Religions Initiative, a lot of groups working very, very hard to bring spirituality more into the UN framework. And another point I think that's really central to this is part of the challenge has been, can spiritual and ethical and values-based groups really weigh in effectively on policy issues? And so as the UN moved more and more towards economic growth and economics as the driver, the challenge became, how do we as spiritual people really intersect that whole dialogue in a way that's effective? Meditating's great, but it's also important to change policy and practice, and then to sort of intervene in some effective way in the debates that are going on, where you're bracketing little phrases and changing words and sitting in these very long and drawn-out debates. How to do that very effectively. So I would say that in the 80s, a lot of the debates went very materialistic, and also groups like particularly the European Union were very resistant to any inclusion of religion or spirituality in any kind of document, not just them. And part of that was because they were suspicious about who it was that were advancing these kinds of concerns. We could see that in the Tripartite Commission. We could see that in this effort to create a UN decade for interreligious, whatever it was called, intercultural collaboration for peace or something. A lot of tensions there, but I think what we're starting to see now is the emergence of a new receptivity to spiritual issues. Part of that's because we've tried other things and they haven't worked. All of the science about climate change, or all of the arguments about the GDP and how inadequate it is, and all of the efforts to kind of motivate people to provide adequate financing for development, or to provide green technology transfer. We have all the tools, we have all of the resources we need. They're just all concentrated in the hands of too few, and who aren't following, in my opinion, the sort of core focus of what spirituality is all about. And so what's happening even in the policy world is the beginning of a real reflection on where do we turn, since our current worldview paradigm isn't actually taking us there. And so that's one of the most wonderful things that I've seen in the whole series of debates on the Sustainable Development Goals, is how these representatives, permanent representatives from 193 countries, Syria, Ukraine, Russia, US, and countries that aren't really getting along very well, either within them or between them, how these people actually really arrived at an affirmation of the 2030 agenda for global action transforming our world. And the constant rhetoric in all the open working group meetings, as well as in the intergovernmental negotiations over the last year, was business as usual is not an option, transformative change is needed. And I remember one of the last meetings of the intergovernmental negotiation for post-2015, people were talking about, we've agreed on this, how do we bring it home? And the whole issue really is, there was some kind of rising to affirm, as there was at the beginning of the United Nations, a transformative agenda. But the challenge that these permanent representatives, ambassadors face, is how do they bring it back to their own countries? How do we implement this? How do we develop both the indicators and the new governance structures that involve civil societies, that enable stakeholders to have a say in what happens? I think one sign of hope, there's been a struggle all along to figure out, can we create some kind of body, some kind of interreligious, faith-based group that's a major group, that has some standing, that's a permanent interagency consulting body. And one of the signs of real hope, I think, is what Aza Karam is doing now. And when she was working with the United Nations Interagency Task Force on engaging with faith-based organizations, she did an essay, I don't remember where, and it started out, it was titled, "Gotta Have Faith in the UN." And the idea was, you know, you gotta have faith in the UN, in both meanings of it. And this Religion and Development post-2015 book that she did is really incredible in terms of finding pathways for us to move into shaping governance and indicators. So I think actually there is a lot of opportunity for us as faith-based spiritual and religious organizations to make a difference in shaping next year's structures and indicators. And I hope we can all join together to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I guess the most common verbiage I hear from people who look at what's happening is that nothing's happening. People who are outside, those of us privileged enough to spend some time inside, think that nothing is happening. But so much is happening, and I'm a great believer in the 100th monkey. That sooner or later, maybe that organization of faith-based groups and religions, and a mega organization will come, because sometimes that's what it takes to get recognition, is to have a body of bodies big enough, numerous enough, for other people looking at it to say, well, maybe this is a worthwhile way to go. Because it's always been there. It's not as if somewhere between 1945 and now spirituality didn't happen at the United Nations. There was a note by then Secretary General Kofi Annan in the year 2000 when he said, for many of us the axiom could well be, we pray, therefore we are. He also said that at the heart we're dealing with universal values, to be merciful, to be tolerant, to love thy neighbor, and he added, and there's no mystery here. Such values are deeply ingrained in the human spirit itself, and it's little wonder that the same values animate the Charter of the United Nations and lie at the root of our search for world peace. It's not as if it's unheard of in all the time from 1945 to now, but there haven't been enough people to hear it. And I think the thing that really energized me at one point was the anniversary of the introduction of World Interfaith Harmony Week, and we had this wonderful program in the General Assembly. And the chair of the General Assembly at that point brought the words spiritual, spirituality, and faith-based into the language spoken in that room, I think for the first time. I know that there were those of us sitting there with our mouths hanging open as we heard him talking these words into the live microphone for the world to hear, and especially the world within the United Nations. So I think my message to most people is when I start talking about what's happening here, and suddenly there's kind of a blank look as people are reviewing what's not happening, that thing that's going on in their brains about what's not happening, is for me to remind them, yes, there are successes. Yes, we are moving forward. Yes, we're not at a standstill. Yes, some of the things we see out there, obvious, and some people are just paying lip service. But there's an awful lot of people who are now actually actively working to bring peace, to bring prosperity, to bring equality to all of the peoples of the world, to all of the countries of the world, and please God, to the planet herself.